26th of August 1842. Joseph Beanland, a debtor, last night attempted to escape. Disguised himself having a moustache and a light-coloured coat. He pretended it was only a jest. But if he repeats such a jest, I shall apply to the magistrates to have him confined to the felons' side of the jail. I have ordered him into solitary confinement. 3 days.
York Castle Museum today attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors every year, right through from local people to tourists visiting from all over the world. The building is a former prison which housed not only felons, but also people who found themselves in debt. Between the early 1730s and the 1880s, the top 2 floors were known as the Debtors Prison, and people sent here stayed until their debt was paid, however long that took. So what was it like to be a debtor here? And as a society, why do we have debt? We are 7 York St John's BA Honours History students, and we've spent months trying to answer just that. Here's a brief look at some of what we found.
Well, we're sat at the entrance, in a way, the first room of the first floor, which really makes up the very entrance to the debtors' prison of what is a 3-storey U-shaped building. The ground floor being principally for felons, those who'd committed a crime. Actually, debtors were put in prison because they couldn't pay their creditors, at the behest of their creditors more than the law itself. This is the room that we're now sitting in, where the jailer would have actually welcomed people in a prison way, and then taken them off to their cells to spend their time. But of course it was a costly business being in prison, so you paid to come through the front door, you paid for absolutely everything, and there was a scale of charges. The 2 floors that made up the debtors' prison are a really interesting set of spaces. They're very uniform, they're very box-like, but they're very plush, that you wouldn't recognise them as perhaps cells as we think of them. And they're arranged on two floors of a U shape, so with these sort of U-shaped corridors, with access to exercise yards so they could get out and feel some fresh air. But debtors weren't as constricted as felons, so actually they could use a lot more of the space. They could even wander into town, some of them at certain times during the history. We call the whole building the debtors' prison, but that really the 2 floors, which now look like offices and museum display spaces, represent the debtors' prison.
A debtor was someone who up until 1869 in Britain could be imprisoned for owing someone money. There was a specific definition for being a debtor and one for being a bankrupt. You could only claim bankruptcy if you were a trader who owned more than £100. If you were not a trader and you owed any sum of money, or if you were a trader and you owed less than £100, then you could be imprisoned for debt. Well, debt was absolutely no respecter of persons at all. Virtually anyone could end up in prison for debt. You might be a gentleman farmer who'd had a bad harvest, couldn't pay your suppliers. You could be a publican and your beer went off and suddenly you couldn't meet your bills. So it could be very smart people. You had knights of the realm who were imprisoned for debt, and it could be very poor labouring people who just couldn't make their ends meet.
10th of December 1843. George and William Bromit still refuse to remove into one of the rooms appropriated to the 3rd class, to which class they belong. They also refused to go to chapel this day, Sunday. I have therefore given them another day, solitary.
There are 3 main reasons why people have debts, and they haven't changed over the centuries. And the 3 reasons are impatience, bad luck, and optimism. So impatience, what that means is that people, they don't want to wait until they've saved up enough money to buy something. They want to buy it now, so they borrow in the expectation of being able to pay back in the future. Of course, that's where the problems occur, when you don't generate enough income in the future to pay back. But normally, that's a good thing, and there's been a big change in the way Britain has worked in the last few years, with greater opportunities to borrow to do that. So that's the good side. The bad luck is when you suffer a loss of income, you become unemployed, and you want to maintain your levels of consumption, So you borrow to do this, and this not only applies to people, but it applies to government. So we see in a recession, for example, that governments borrow heavily in order to be able to maintain their levels of expenditure. And the third reason, optimism, that's because we have some idea for the future. We want to invest, so we borrow money and we hope to be able to repay it in the future. But this can have good outcomes and it can have bad outcomes.
So what was the relationship between life inside and outside the prison for debtors? And how did debtors find being in such close proximity to felons?
In some ways, life inside the prison was very much like life outside the prison. It replicates the structures of British society quite a lot. It's very much a strong class hierarchy. So of the 2 floors of York Castle Jail that were used for the debtors' prison, the first floor, which had the higher windows and the bigger rooms, that was for smart, respectable debtors. That was called the master's side, and they lived on the same floor as the governor, and the chapel was on the first floor as well. The poor debtors, who were classified as really, really poor, and who didn't have titles, who weren't esquire or who weren't sir, they lived on the top floor, which was smaller rooms, smaller windows, and it was very much more crowded up there. And the master's side of the debtors, they sort of made the rules for how life worked inside the debtors' prison. So in some ways it's not so dissimilar to life outside the prison walls.
Well, the views of the debtors would have been lovely, I think. And until 1835, until they built the new prison, when you had literally this wormwood scrubs of gritstone dropped in, you saw a beautiful view, much as we see today really from the building, to be honest with you. We see the fosse at the back, the River Ouse, Clifford's Tower. Actually, it's a lovely view. And I don't know whether that's good or bad, whether that inspires you to think, I want to get out of this place, or whether you think, gosh, I wish I was out there and I want to escape. Also, the windows that were provided in the cells, the fenestration is really nice. They're quite grand, they're quite large, they're quite light and airy spaces. So you were locked up, you were denied your liberty to a degree, but you had nice views at the same time. So I think there's a real interesting psychological dilemma there in your head.
The debtors were in close personal contact, or could be, with the felons. The felons used to exercise in the front courtyard of the building. There was a fence across the 2 wings and they had this small courtyard. The debtors, on the other hand, had the entire castle grounds in which to walk in. So they could speak with the felons through the railings of the fence across the felons' courtyard. So there was a lot of communication going on backwards and forwards. There was obviously some passing of contraband. We have accounts of, for example, a loaf of bread coming in which, when it was stabbed, was revealed to have a pig's bladder full of gin inside. So there were quite a lot of temptations for debtors, I think, to pass things to felons and to receive payment in return, because some of the felons would have had more financial resources than the debtors did. But at the same time, it was also quite a shocking environment. You have some of the debtors who've led a fairly sheltered, respectable middle-class life, and they suddenly find themselves at close proximity with people who are wanted for horrendous crimes. And it was one of the proximity between debtors and felons was one of the issues that agitated prison reformers in the late 18th century and early 19th century. They're saying we need to keep these classes of people more separate.
7th of October 1842. William Whittaker, a debtor, 24 hours solitary for threatening to strike John Hutchinson, another debtor. The said John Hutchinson informs me that John Townsend, a debtor, has been selling ale for some days and had a quantity of bottles hid in a certain place. I sent George Thompson, second turnkey, to search for the bottles. He found 17. This ale was not fetched in the regular way, but purchased of other debtors, as having the county allowance of bread, which bread I have directed to be discontinued.
If you live in York today and have local ancestry, you may have had a relative who was a debtor here. Carl Sciletto has been tracing his family history and believes that one of his ancestors spent some time in York Debtors Prison.
Well, predominantly most of my family come from the Tadcaster, West Yorkshire and also Wetherby area. I believe that William Sciletto, who was in the York Debtors Prison, is related to my family. He was a solicitor. I believe he came from Leeds, but say the area he worked in was around Wetherby area, Tadcaster, Leeds area, York. That coincides with the entries in the documents that he prepared for, I think it was a 3-year period. Well, it's quite amazing really to see, say distant ancestors on, well, something written in his own hand and the clients he dealt with. And it'd be most interesting to find a lot more about him. Well, having a debtor in the family and somebody who was in prison for that, mixed feelings on that. Nowadays, debt is much more accepted, I suppose, than it was back in those days. If I'm to feel anything, given his profession as a solicitor and the reputation of solicitors, I don't know which is worse, a debtor or a solicitor, to be honest with you.
17th of January 1844. Reverend J.G. Hounsfield, a debtor receiving the county allowance, has received a piece of ham sent per railway, which I allow him to have, as were I to detain it at any length, it would spoil. But I have intimated to him that no provision is to be received by those debtors who receive the full county allowance, and if any more comes, I shall not allow him to have it, without he consents to give up the provision provided him by the county. He is a deep, designing man, and will use every stratagem to evade the rules of this jail.
At York Castle Museum today, some of the original debtors' cells are now galleries showcasing exhibits to visitors. But behind the scenes, many are being used as museum archives and offices for staff who work here. But what's it like to work in a building that used to be a prison?
It's quite interesting working on this site because you do, in a way, you do feel like you're working in a building with a lot of history and a past. When I arrived, I discovered next to my desk is some graffiti. There is graffiti all over the building from the debtors. This is very beautiful graffiti, beautifully script written, and it's William Blythe from York, it says. 28 days, came in August the 11th, 1883, goes out September the 7th, 1883. And I kind of want to write next to it, came in November 2011, going out April 2014, because that's kind of my plan. But I don't have to be here really, no one's got me locked in a room and making me be here.
When I was told I was moving into this particular office, I was the first one to kind of bags this desk, because I love the view out of the window at the at Clifford's Tower, and I just think it's a great view to have out of this particular building. But the other thing I quite like about working here as well is on your way out of the building, I don't know whether you've noticed, there is a stone with graffiti on, prisoners' graffiti, and it refers to this place. This prison is a house of care, a grave for man alive, and I quite like that idea, a grave for man alive, and sometimes I think I'm in a grave for man alive.
It is a horrible building. It is dark, smelly, narrow, claustrophobic and uncomfortable, sometimes too hot, sometimes too cold, and really difficult to work in. The strange thing is, but half the people in York love it because it's their castle museum and it's been in their lives, and they've come as children, and they've come in as parents, and they're coming as grandparents, and it's wonderful. But actually, you go back far enough, it was horrible, where people were executed and died and lived miserable lives and had a horrible time. But actually, to work in it, you also get a little bit of free sort of that, but it is a very, very difficult space. It was never designed for modern living at all.
When you're working in here, you do definitely feel as though you're in quite an enclosed space, and sometimes that can feel quite claustrophobic. The way that sound alters and changes around the building, is quite eerie at times. You hear patches, you don't hear patches. You're very much centred in your own little space. It's quite a strange building to be in. I always think, I've worked in quite a lot of historical houses and period properties, and I always think that buildings do take on the feeling or the atmosphere of their original purpose. There's something in the mortar or the bricks or the stone that absorbs the stories from the past. And I find it quite an intimidating building.
I find most interesting that an office I work in has been a cell for debtors. It has been the family home for military warders. It has been a place where people dished out allotments, and it's been my office, or it's been an office of a curator for a long period of time. So 4 walls, a floor and a ceiling and a couple of windows have seen 300 years of people living in that space for very, very different reasons. And some have left graffiti on the walls. I'm very tempted to. I'm sure I'll get into trouble. Which, you know, from 1800s still stand the test of time. So for me, when I'm bored, or when it works too much and you're thinking, oh, bed work, you think, actually, you know what, I'm in a space that's had a life of 300 years, and people have been incarcerated in it, people have grown up in it, people have pushed paper in it. You know, actually, that to me is a really exciting thing.
15th of October, 1841. Mary Mawson, committed here for 1 calendar month for attempting to bring spirituous liquor into the debtors' prison, was delivered of a female child this night, 15th of October, 1841.
So debt is nothing new, and thankfully we don't get locked up for it anymore. But we still have a culture of debt in our society, and many of us today might have ended up in a debtor's prison. So, will we always have debt?
We always have had debt. Debt isn't necessarily a bad thing. Economists would say it's an intertemporal reallocation of resources. And that simply means that we want to consume today rather than consume in the future. And when people take out a mortgage to buy a house, that's exactly what they're doing. They want the benefits of owning a house today, and they borrow the money to buy it. We always will have debt. I can't imagine any circumstances where we don't have debt. Indeed, an economist would say it's optimal to have debt.
6th of April, 1843. Mary Moss, debtor, was discharged this day, having been an inmate of this prison for 24 years and 7 days.